Liberty or equality? The challenge of our time. Erik von Kuehnelt-Leddihn. 1952. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Chapter 5. The Political Temper of Catholic Nations. It is surprising to observe how constantly we find theology at the bottom of our political questions. P. J. Proudhon, Les Confessions d'un Révolutionnaire. Paris, 1849, p. 61. 1. The social implications of Catholicism. Of all the external elements shaping the character of individuals as well as of groups, religion is, perhaps, the strongest. This should not surprise us, because every higher religion offers us an almost complete picture of a meaningful universe. It points out a destination and a way. It is, therefore, self-evident that different religions involve different ways of life. They will influence our temperaments. We should never underrate the effect of such other factors as geography, meteorology, biology, nourishment, history, sociology, yet the great changes resulting from the conversion of large groups cannot leave us unimpressed. Even after a short time, entirely new behavior patterns emerge. One has only to compare the inhabitants of Catholic and of Protestant islands in the Hebrides in order to appreciate the importance of the religious factor, or to compare villages belonging to these two different religious communities in central Germany, in Hungary, in the Netherlands, Latvia or Switzerland. An invisible line divides the cultural patterns of these communities, even though they speak the same language and obey the same laws. England before and after the Reformation, Scotland before and after the Reformation, Norway before and after the Reformation, were different nations. The influence of the religious factor also extends to economics. The disproportionate wealth of French Protestants shows it sufficiently. Max Weber, Trielch, Tawney, Fonfani and Krauss have written profusely on this subject. In this chapter the searchlight of our investigation will be focused on the political behavior pattern, rather than on the ideologies, of Catholic nations. Forced, under these circumstances, to generalize on this matter, but at the same time endeavoring to avoid the grossest oversimplifications, we will try to compare the attitude of Catholic, and Greek Orthodox, nations and ethnic groups with those of their Protestant equivalents. Comparison, and not the setting of absolute standards, is our aim. The reader is, first of all, reminded that the Reformation set out as a rigoristic reaction against late medieval laxity and liberalism, as well as against the Renaissance and humanism. Saint Clement Maria Hofbauer declared about the Reformation, "The revolt from the Church began because the German people could not and cannot but be devout." To this Catholic saint the deeply religious, non-libertarian character of the Reformation was obvious. But because of its inherent dialectics, Protestantism came in subsequent centuries to occupy a stand diametrically opposed to its original position. Hence almost all Protestant criticisms leveled against Catholicism are today just the reverse of those directed against the Church 400 years ago. No modern, liberal Protestant would accuse the Catholics of placing the accent on man rather than on God, of being swayed by the fads of their age, of being too broad-minded, easygoing and carnal. Such strictures might be passed upon them by fundamentalists or backwoods preachers, but not by the enlightened man in the street, who is impressed by the existence of a legion of decency, the efforts by Catholics to enact anti-birth control legislation, and their rejection of divorce and euthanasia. Catholic dogma, except for an increase in volume, has remained unchanged, and commentary on it has varied only within certain limits. Protestantism, on the other hand, is in a constant process of evolution. Whereas the faith of Catholics can be exposed to the process of diminution de la foi, diminution of the faith, that of the Protestant is also subject to the rétrécissement de la foi, narrowing of the faith, the gradual abolishment of the very articles of faith. Still, the fact remains that Protestantism is essentially medieval, or, if we prefer, post-medieval. This is documented by the fact that Protestantism clung to the Gothic style long after it had become obsolete in the Catholic world. Even today the Gothic style is prevalent among American churches and colleges, with the Catholic minority joining in. Of course, it cannot be denied that Protestant medievalism has been emptied of its soul through a relativizing and liberalizing process. Anybody visiting the Gothic skyscraper, the Cathedral of Learning of Pittsburgh University, will be struck by the sight of professors in medieval gowns and mortar boards teaching pragmatist and instrumentalist philosophy. Yet the facade remains in also many thought patterns. Thus the real year of the Reformation is not 1517, but 1511, when Martin Luther, the Augustinian friar on his mission in Rome, for the first time in his life was face to face with the Renaissance. Here was a man from the backwoods of Christendom aghast at the grandiose effort toward a synthesis between Christendom and the immortal and lasting values of antiquity. The annexationist character of Catholicism had been hidden to him, and the fact that the synthesis became only perfect in the Baroque he could not guess. Yet what he disapproved of was the cultural aspect of the Renaissance, which said God and man from a circle Catholic culture had turned to an elliptic form with two foci. After all, man was created in the image of God, and his destiny was to become more godlike after death. There is a real process of theosis envisaged, as we find it, in a different form, also in Eastern theology. Hence the veneration of saints. But the Reformers replied to these efforts soli Deo Gloria. And tried desperately to go back to the Middle Ages, back to some sort of imaginary catacomb church, back to the Old Testament. Unless we are able to picture Luther wandering around in Rome as a hillbilly preacher from the Alleghenies on Broadway in New York, we do not understand the initial spark which started the 16th century wave of reformers. Thus, with the exception of Melanchthon and Zwingli, there are only very minor figures among the reformers who tried to ride the crest of the wave of humanism. The most outstanding humanists everywhere rallied sooner or later to the cause of the Church Universal. So did St. Thomas More, so did Erasmus, so did Reuchlin, the great anti-clerical who had fought monkish narrowness all through his life. And while Catholic culture centered around the dual focus of the glory of God and the glory of man, while Catholic painters directed their interest towards the objects of this world, towards man and woman in the nude, as God made them, Protestantism was engaged in a new rigorism. It is a grave mistake to see in Luther a confirmed libertine, who overvalued sex and marriage. His concept of marriage is one of carnality to end all carnality. Protestantism is very profoundly anti-erotic. Thus the key to the real understanding of the Catholic cultures of the European continent and of South and Central America is, for the Protestant as well as for the Catholic of the British Isles and North America, an understanding and appreciation of the cultural, artistic and intellectual values of humanism, the Renaissance and the Baroque. The fact that Irish Catholicism has only very peripherically been through this evolution is of paramount importance, especially the inner understanding of the Baroque is by no means easy to those belonging to the English-speaking nations, and E.I. Watkin is one of the few who came to see the true greatness of the Jesuit style. Yet it took him years to disentangle himself from the notions imparted to him by Ruskin. In order to come to symbolic comprehension of the Catholic Protestant antithesis, one must compare two paintings, The Birth of Venus by Botticelli and American Gothic by Grant Wood. The Birth of Venus follows a pagan pattern, but every sensitive person will perceive that this is a Christian Venus, surrounded by a hardly perceptible glow of sensuality, yet expressing a real synthesis of eros and agape, earthly and divine love. She is a baptized Venus. The painting of Grant Wood shows us a very Protestant American farmer and his wife with a white, Gothic wooden church in the background. The man holds in his hand a pitchfork with painfully pointed prongs. His balding pate, his thin lips, his clean spectacles no less than his prim and severe wife at his side frighten no less a man than Albert J. Nock. The outcry of bigots which could be heard at the end of the 19th century that the Democratic Party in New York stood for Romanism and rebellion was somehow not without substance when we translate this accusation with joie de vivre, Catholicism and individualism. To our ears, at least, the reverse, prohibition, Protestantism and prostration hardly sounds more attractive. This is by no means an original theory, but a thesis alluded to by D.H. Lawrence and Everett Dean Martin, who emphasize the fact that Americans have tried to flee the Middle Ages, but never thought themselves out of them. Thus it has escaped the attention of many neutral observers not conversant with the respective theologies that Catholicism, though blessed with a rigid and authoritarian ecclesiastical organization, has a liberal and personalistic theology, while the teachings of Luther and Calvin are characterized by a metaphysical severity which had, and sometimes still has, its concrete political and cultural manifestations. This was most evident in the political sphere. Calvin established in Geneva the first truly totalitarian police state in Europe, and Luther conferred excessive authority on the magistrate. Calvin's dogma of predestination had in itself no liberal implications, and Luther's belief in the utter wretchedness of human nature after the fall sanctioned brutal suppression by the state authorities. Still, G. P. Gooch is right when he calls Calvin the father of modern democracy in spite of himself. Neither should it be doubted that Luther, through his concept of private interpretation, his subjectivism, and his notions on church organization, planted seeds which centuries later produced an astounding harvest. In spite of infideism, which relegated all deceased non-Christians to the everlasting horrors of hellfire, and his emphasis on the divine prerogatives of the magistrate, he is through a long dialectic process a forefather of modern democracy. The Catholic theological paternity of democracy is of a much more direct character. St. Thomas, though insisting in De Regimine Principum on the superiority of an elective monarchy, the supporters of an elective monarchy, by the way, Are always royalists suspicious of the principle of heredity, expresses in the Summa, I2, Q. 105, A. 1, a preference for a mixed government. The idea of popular sovereignty, and other democratic leanings, can also be found among the late Jesuit scholastics. Yet by no means all theological opinions, and not even all dogmas, find a strong psychological echo among the masses. Although Catholicism, prior to the American and French revolutions, emphasized democratic values more strongly than Protestantism on either side of the Atlantic, the affinity between the Church and democracy was for all practical purposes never a very strong one. To proceed from theological and philosophical concepts to delicate and highly intellectualized formulations in political matters is one thing, but to make them widely accepted is quite another. The Catholic Weltbild or view of the world lacked in its fundamental aspects most of the qualities that would have been needed to absorb a politically democratic order which bore no relationship to the social, religious or intellectual forces and tendencies of Catholic societies. Traditional Catholic culture was always of a basically patriarchal pattern, characterized by a ubiquity of fatherhood which automatically fostered royal over republican institutions. The concept of society, in accordance with the whole Weltbild, was hierarchic. The main pressures and the very grain of existence were vertical rather than horizontal. This secular order by no means contradicted the other, metaphysical hierarchy of souls. Even the medieval serf knew that simple fishermen were among the saints, and he could see in numerous churches murals representing hell peopled by tortured popes, kings and bishops. This, however, was by no means egalitarianism. Egalitarianism in the modern sense existed nowhere. What appears to be egalitarianism is merely the strong consciousness of the mystery of the human soul which, though equal with all others at its inception, has to face struggles and temptations, experiences, defeats and victories which rapidly destroy the initial pattern of spiritual equality. Human equality in the Catholic orbit is thus nothing but the acute feeling of man's inability to scrutinize and evaluate the status of souls. Besides this notion of what we may call, quite arbitrarily, the hidden soul, there is the knowledge that the roles played by persons here on earth may be thoroughly reversed on the other side of the grave, where all cards will be reshuffled for a new deal. He has filled the hungry with good things, and sent the rich empty away. It would be wrong to consider these vistas to be without strongness worldly implications, but the very symbol of what is usually taken for Catholic democracy, in the social sense, is the skull and crossbones, whose omnipresence is nowhere more impressive than in the vaults of the Capuchins in Vienna, where the Habsburgs, the quondam masters of Christendom, are buried. When the Pope enters St. Peter's for the coronation ceremony, he is greeted by a monk who blows out a candle, admonishing him not to forget that he is mortal like the rest of humanity. This thanatocentrism of Catholic nations is also, partially, the key to their latent revolutionism as well as to their peculiar craving for freedom. It is significant that sanguinary revolutions did not take place in Protestant countries after the evanescence of the earlier rigorism, i.e., after 1700. Civil wars in Protestant countries were henceforward interterritorial wars, as in the United States, 1776, 1861, and in Switzerland, 1847. The connection between death and freedom is, of course, an obvious one. The Calvinistic and Old Testament notion of taking earthly success as a sign of divine favor and next worldly promise is absent in Catholic nations, where the beggar is a useful member of society and commercialism is not highly appreciated. Professor Alison Piers was once accosted in Madrid by a beggar who uttered the following request: Una limosna, Señor, por el amor de Dios, que en la plenitud de mi juventud me ha quitado la gana de trabajar, an alms for the love of God, who in the fullness of my youth has taken from me the appetite for work. In Portugal we have the poor farmer, the cabanero, who supplements his meager income by professional begging, especially in the Trás-os-Montes region. As for commercialism, it was never forgotten by Catholic nations that the merchants and money changers in the temple were the only people physically chastised by our Lord. St. Thomas Aquinas considered trading illicit activity only under extraordinary circumstances, Summa 2-2, Q. 77, 4, and objected to a large commercial class in an ideal city, De Regimine Principum, 2. 3. It is hardly necessary to refer to the works dealing with the relationship between capitalism and Protestantism. Under these circumstances, it is not surprising that Catholicism has a greater affinity with agrarian than with urban society. The urban share of Protestants in organically grown societies will always be larger than that of Catholics, though immigration created a different picture in the United States. The separation of state and church, which forces the church to raise money for the subsistence of the clergy, etc., thus constitutes a psychological problem in Catholic societies, where the businessman has little social status, and bishops are rarely chosen for their commercial qualifications. Patriarchalism, with a relative, functional hierarchy, harmonizes best with the traditional mentality of Catholic nations, which are demophile but not democratic. The Catholic program is probably best expressed by a Spanish saying: Tener un hijo plantar un árbol escribir un libro. To have a son, to plant a tree, to write a book. Here we find the synthesis of patriarchalism, agriculture and artistry, a perfectly reactionary pattern. Compare with Mussolini's Un libro e un moschetto, fascista perfetto, a book and a musket make a perfect fascist, intellect and the old Petrine curse, brute force. It is obvious that external as well as internal influences can adversely affect, or even destroy, large segments of this pattern without necessarily eliminating basic, i.e., theological, notions. This has happened again and again in the last 160 years. Such changes are, since they involve a series of intellectual and psychological conflicts, of a revolutionary rather than an evolutionary nature. The resulting uneasy compromises between the religious genius of Catholic nations, their shaken societies, and their often totally uncongenial forms of government, create grave tensions and perpetuate the revolutionary fervor. Hence Hegel despaired of the possibility of seeing a sensible constitution, Vernunftige Verfassung, realized within the framework of the Catholic religion. This is the reason why the Catholic world in both hemispheres has never recovered its health, sanity and cultural fertility since the hormones of the French Revolution were injected into its system. French Canada, which has been spared Rousseau and Robespierre, is the rather significant exception. It is also obvious that the ideological substance of the French Revolution is almost in its entirety the product of Protestant dialectics. Although there are some minor Cartesian and Jansenistic elements in the political philosophy of 89 and 92, the main impulses came from America, Britain, Holland, and Switzerland. It is thus very doubtful whether any stability in the Catholic world could be regained short of either the total destruction of the Catholic religion or the restitution of a Catholic way of life in conformity with a homogeneous Catholic view of the world. Neither event seems probable in the near future. In the meantime, we have seen repeated perversions of traditional Catholic socio-political trends. To illustrate this, we have shown in the preceding chapter how the drives fostering personal dictatorship of the mass party pattern, the plebiscitarian tyranny, came from residues of patriarchalism, notwithstanding the fact that this perversion of patriarchal sentiments was deeply egalitarian and democratic, illiberal and populistic. 2. The Catholic character. It is not surprising, therefore, that practically all efforts to establish a lasting organic connection between Catholicism and the new regime were bound to fail. The rigidity and relative immutability of Catholic teaching, Catholic dogma and the whole Catholic mentality prevented all permanent cooperation. While modern, liberal Protestantism is easily swayed and influenced by the issues of the day and the opinions of the world, Catholicism is relatively unpliable, and often prefers to suffer rather than to conform. In matters of dogma, the rigidity is, naturally, complete. Though an impediment so far as momentary advantage is concerned, this dislike for compromise in essentials is no less helpful to the Church than her exclusiveness. This attitude has influenced the character of Catholic nations, which often have been decried as unreasonable and uncooperative. Thus, when Harry Hopkins, President Roosevelt's emissary to Stalin, was blamed for having agreed to the Fifth Partition of Poland, he answered quite characteristically, "After all, what does it matter? The Poles are like the Irish. They are never satisfied with anything, anyhow." Among the Protestant faiths, it is subjectivism, embodied in the principle of private interpretation, and the lack of a central, infallible teaching authority which render them so frequently up to date, deprived of a captain and torn from its moorings. The ship of Protestantism drifts along the currents, while Greek orthodoxy stays in a dry dock of immobility. Catholicism now has to sail against the wind and against the currents. This is the reason why it so frequently seems out of tune with the spirit of the times, frequently but, perhaps, not always and not forever, because we are again beginning to live in an age of dogmatic affirmations. Even Protestant neo-orthodoxy is partly a reaction against liberal conformism, in an age when the failure of a Russellian humanitarianism and of shadowy ethical notions without a religious foundation are so evident. While Luther rejected rationality in the strongest terms, and thus fostered the rise of fideism and subjectivism, Catholic theology emphasized reason and logic very firmly. Yet it must also be added that the Church has always been apprehensive about the misuse of reason. This stand has not been affected by the strongly rationalistic and realistic character of Catholic theology since the days of St. Thomas. In contradiction to St. Thomas, and to Luther, after all, the Church often seemed to take the position that man is rather stupid than wicked. Protestantism, though rather pessimistic about the spiritual qualities of the sin cripple, nevertheless gave him the Bible without explanatory footnotes, trusting in his intelligence, or inspiration. Catholicism, on the other hand, frequently tended to adopt the view that a superficial half-education was much worse than no education at all, and thus in Catholic countries we saw, and sometimes still see, a large number of illiterates side by side with an intellectual elite of high standards. The Protestant goal of education is usually one of good averages, the optimum for a democracy. In democracies there will always be resentment and contempt for the highbrow and the illiterate, the intellectual and the peasant. A comparison of the French Canadians with their English-speaking co-nationals, or of Americans with Argentines, will confirm this. The strong intellectualization of the professional classes in French Canada contributes to the incompatibility between the two races. In Quebec City, for instance, the poems of Claudel are sold at Woolworths and Kresge's. Still, the emphasis on reason in Catholic theology, which works for an intellectual discipline, produces also an exclusiveness characteristic of all systems adhering to logic. The typical Catholic thinker would always insist that only one or none of two contradictory statements can be right, but not both. The modern liberal attitude that both can be right in their own ways springs from the supposition that either objective truth does not exist or is humanly unattainable. Such a position automatically engenders a latitudinarianism which, among Protestants for instance, encourages interfaith movements, and, in the political scene, greatly reduces the antagonisms between political parties. If the latter have a broad common denominator, the indulgent voter will see in them mere ins and outs. The notion that an adversary may be right without impinging on one's own objective correctness of view is, indeed, an indispensable quality for every nation governed by parliamentary institutions. At the same time, it is obvious that there are, often fairly narrowly set, limits to the agreed dissent. Prompted by a subconscious fear of total atomization, Protestant societies will frequently watch the common denominator with jealous zeal. And thus a social totalitarianism soon ensues. Everett Dean Martin, a Congregationalist minister, went even further and insisted that private interpretation led directly to intolerance and, among the multitudes, fortified ignorance with the delusion of infallibility, circumscribed the outlook of many men with an unimaginative liberalism and rationalized the crowd's will to power. Liberty, p. 124. Catholic nations, that is, nations with a Catholic culture and Catholic religious convictions of varying intensity, have an entirely different turn of mind. If they are liberal, their liberalism springs from generosity, and not from any notion that contradictory opinions are mutually inclusive. Very significant is the popular modern expression persuasion for religion. One might die a martyr's death for a conviction, a faith. But for a persuasion? To the convinced Catholic his religion is true and rational. We have heard it said that James Joyce, once erroneously reported as having embraced Protestantism, was congratulated on his conversion by an enthusiastic lady. "Madam," the former Catholic and agnostic neophyte replied, "you are mistaken. I have lost my faith, I have not lost my reason." Convictions, whether religious or political, in the Catholic world assume an absolute character, and sometimes even involve supreme sacrifices. Mere laws and regulations, constitutional charters, the results of elections, and even brutal coercion frequently cannot cope with the forces of dissent, which will retaliate by revolutions, rebellions and assassinations. It is significant that the vast majority of political murders in the last 100 years was carried out predominantly by people with a Catholic, Greek Orthodox or Jewish background. Yet political criminals were treated in most Catholic countries with a mildness which would shock Protestant nations. Friedrich Adler, the assassin of Count Sturge, Austrian Prime Minister in 1916, was condemned to death, but released from jail after 2 years. Gavrilo Princip, the assassin of the Archduke Francis Ferdinand, received a prison sentence only. In Russia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, only assassins or would-be assassins of members of the imperial family were executed. There was no death penalty for any other crime, including murder. The communist martyrs are thus practically all victims of mob violence or of the Civil War period. It must also be noted that most Western countries had special gentlemanly jails for political offenders, fortress in Germany, state prison in Austria and Hungary, etc. But Protestant countries, significantly, went to either of two extremes in their penal procedure: abolishment of death penalty, Scandinavia, Holland, or indiscriminate death penalty for all major crimes, Britain. The former attitude has its roots in humanitarianism, the latter in agnosticism. The Catholic would reason that if the sentence is too light, the criminal still will have to pay the balance in the next world. As a result, we find in Catholic countries a tendency towards violence which, coupled with the Catholic thirst for the absolute, sometimes takes the most extreme forms. Of course, one must not forget that many Catholic nations are also racially more excitable than their northern, Protestant neighbors. Even Bavaria is more radical than Prussia, and Austria more radical than Bavaria, Yet Germany, for a variety of reasons, is not classifiable as a Protestant country, see below, Chapter 7, pages 232, 243. But even a philosopher like Miguel de Unamuno, to cite an example, was strong in his denunciation of peace and yearned for a civil war, which finally broke out the year before he died. Yet if we want a vivid description of Catholic revolutionary absolutism, we have to turn to a passage of Ramón de Valle-Inclán's Los Cruzados de la Causa, a novel dealing with the First Carlist War. There he features a discussion between a nun and her bellicose old uncle, the Marqués de Bradomín. The nun says, Don Carlos is still not going to rule in Spain. He will in Navarre, and in Álava and in Vizcaya. The nun joined her hands with a gesture which was at the same time graceful and determined. But, uncle, in order to make justice triumph in this way, half of Spain will have to be depopulated. The voice of the guardian sounded with a muffled echo in the vastness of the hall. God depopulated the world by the flood. In this splendid piece of Spanish extremism we see an illustration of that Catholic tendency, so aptly described by Léon Bloy, to be or to become pèlerins de l'absolu, pilgrims of the absolute. And it is precisely the contempt Catholic cultures have for the concept of compromise, the 50-50 so indispensable for parliaments with a pluriparty system, which degrades the figure of democratic politicians in the public eye more than in Protestant countries. When people see in politicians mere streetwalkers ready for every trade or deal, respect for political institutions will also suffer in due time. We cannot entirely agree with Huizinga's dictum, The Waning of the Middle Ages, p. 48, that to the Catholic soul the unworthiness of the persons never compromises the sacred character of the institution. Intellectually the Catholic will reject all such empiricism, yet the psychological effects are quite another matter. Modern Protestantism, on the other hand, has developed a real enthusiasm for the concept of compromise, which is so necessary for the ideals of neighborliness, cooperation and solidarity. The opposite attitude would be incompatible with the pattern of the friendly regular guy, ordinary, decent chap, reached your curl, the male ideal of the democracies and plebiscitarian dictatorships. A famous saying of Goering's was, "What we want is regular fellows." The Catholic is not in such need of this lubricant of human intercourse because he is not communitarian, but personalistic or individualistic. But if we ask the average person with an average education whether Protestantism stands for individualism, diversity and freedom, and Catholicism for collectivism, uniformity and authority, we will probably get an answer in the affirmative. Yet as soon as we deal with the matter critically and compare specific national characters, our informant will, perhaps, not only become hesitant but even apologetic about his first, rash answer. And who is, actually, more anarchic and opposed to rules and regulations, the Austrian or the Prussian? The Lithuanian or the Latvian? The Irishman or the Englishman? The Spaniard or the Scandinavian? And if we speak about authoritarianism, the implication is only too often that all pressure comes from above. But we know that authority is not necessarily vertical, it can also be horizontal, i.e., societal instead of political, and the subsequent results from the point of view of individual freedom can thus be at least as disastrous as in a case of a tyranny from above. The neighbors and the community, the two terms are untranslatable, in their sociological meaning, into most continental languages, can exercise an authority and control with a cold ferocity which can only be matched by the ubiquitous police network of a totalitarian state. This is why Count Kaiserling calls America socialistic in a deeper sense and arrives at the conclusion that most Americans want to obey as no soldiers have ever done. D.H. Lawrence's vistas on the non-liberal essence of America are of a similar character. James Tufts doubts that one can choose individualism as an adequate term to characterize American life and institutions. D.W. Brogan supports him in this view, and these criticisms of American horizontal pressure are nothing new. Felix de Buger sensed a lack of freedom in America, and even Jefferson felt compelled to write, "The country which has given to the world the example of physical liberty, owes to it that of moral emancipation also, for as yet it is but nominal with us." The inquisition of public opinion overwhelms, in practice, the freedom asserted by the law in theory. Nonconformity is thus more difficult in a Protestant than in a Catholic society. One has only to ask the American tourist where he felt traditionally freer, in Paris, Munich, Vienna, Rome, Prague, Budapest, Cologne, Madrid, Venice and Innsbruck, or in Amsterdam, Geneva, Berlin, Oslo, Debrecen, Aberdeen, and Salt Lake City. To be sure, the Catholic religion is far more uniform, exacting and rigid than modern Protestantism, but the fact remains that Catholic nations are by nature lawless, individualistic, uncooperative, except when moved by personal affections, aloof and independent. These are also the reasons why the Catholics of Catholic countries are, regardless of the intensity of their religious feelings, so frequently indifferent towards the commandments of their church. Only in dispersion, or on the fringes of the area inhabited by Catholics, do they show a truly Protestant discipline. Count Sforza said, a profound liberty in regard to dogma and discipline, and at the same time an instinctive avoidance of all formal heresy, these are the two most characteristic and constant traits of the religious conscience in Italy. In France, the classic type of the fervent but non-practicing Catholic was probably best represented by Charles Péguy. Slavery, therefore, had, in Catholic countries, the Iberian Peninsula, South and Central America, a character entirely at variance with this institution in Anglo-Saxonry. Army life in Catholic countries is similarly of a much more personal and liberal nature. Since Catholics are hostile to the disciplinarian monotony and rigor of the machine age, the relationship between superiors and subordinates in these armies assumes an informal, patriarchal pattern. There can be no doubt that the present Spanish army has a far less rigorous discipline than the Army of the United States, even though one is the instrument of fascism and the other of democracy. If, for one reason or another, formalism and patriarchalism is impossible, as, for instance, in the French and Spanish foreign legions, the remaining alternative is one between brutality and anarchy. In the case of war, the soldiers of Catholic nations must be thoroughly convinced of the sensibleness of the cause. If these convictions are lacking among Catholic soldiers, who often do not feel bound by the Protestant concept of duty, flict, mutinies or mass desertions may easily result. Hence the greater reliability of Protestant groups and organizations bound by oaths, promises, etc. These will act efficiently and according to plan even if their belief and conviction in the cause has vanished a long time ago. Mechanical action is fairly alien to the Catholic, who is primarily motivated by his, frequently very subjective, conscience. It seems that only a filial affection can supplant conscience and conviction. A mere appeal to duty, or law, will not do the trick. All of which reminds us of Paul Valéry's outcry about the Germans, savoir et devoir, vous êtes suspects. On the other hand, the Portuguese in the Spanish Foreign Legion, the Tercio, were among the best soldiers. During the recent civil war they had accepted the explanation that this struggle was a crusade. But in 1918 they simply had run away before the Germans, since they had not the slightest desire to make Schleswig-Holstein or the Carpatho-Ukraine safe for democracy. The Italian soldier has almost the selfsame reactions. It was said that South Italian soldiers during World War I often applauded with shouts of bravo, capitano. Their officers who, trying to lead them into action, went over the top. These sons of workers and peasants had not the slightest interest in dying for the cause of a North Italian irredenta, a cause dear to the hearts of their officers with a very different political outlook. Yet to generalize about Italian cowardice is nonsense and merely betrays a lack of imagination. The Spanish pride, on the other hand, produces quite different effects. Compare the Spanish proverb, to the king must be sacrificed one's estate and one's life, but honor is the patrimony of the soul, and the soul belongs to God only. At first the violent craving for independence, so prevalent in the Catholic orbit, may seem highly paradoxical. Catholicism, moreover, is authoritarian in its organization, but liberal and personalistic in its theology. Liberal Protestant critics, though well acquainted with the authoritarian and monarchic structure of the Catholic Church and confused by the claim of Rome to absolute truth, have only too frequently ignored the other, more important aspects of Catholicism, which is characterized by a complexio oppositorum. Not only do we find in Catholicism an affirmation of free will, libertas arbitrae, to be more correct, but also a rejection of the idea that the non-Christian cannot be saved. Luther, on the other hand, decidedly rejected free will, see notes 768-69, and rudely rebuked Zwingli, who had expressed a hope to meet with Plato and Socrates in heaven. The problem of free will is dealt with so delicately in the 39 Articles that it is not easy to decide whether Anglicanism is as predestinarian as pure Calvinism, but free will was, beyond doubt, a cherished medieval concept. See, for instance, Dante's Paradiso, Canto V, 19-25, and his De Monarchia, I, 12. It is evident that the strong fideism of Orthodox Protestantism has to result in an exclusiveness in matters of salvation which could never be shared by Rome. The Jansenist tenet, that supernatural grace is not imparted outside the visible church, was expressly condemned by Pope Clement XI in 1713. The idea that the true religion can be enforced, or that those who reject truth with full intellectual knowledge must be in bad faith, nevertheless haunted the Church for many centuries. These two erroneous notions are not based so much on bad theology as on bad psychology and a misunderstanding of the real nature of man. Again we will quote Pascal's "The heart has its reasons which reason does not know." The repressive tendency within the Church is today definitely on its way out, although some rearguard actions are still being fought. The canon law says clearly, section 1351, that no one may be forced to embrace the Catholic faith against his will. No theologian of renown would today question the possibility of the salvation of the non-Catholic as well as the non-Christian. The possible salvation of a heretic, a Jew or a pagan is not only a theological view, but definitely Catholic doctrine. This was well illustrated by the recent suspension of Father Feeney and of the 3 professors at Boston College. Although the Church is the mystical body of Christ, and the Pope is the vicar of Christ on earth, can make infallible pronouncements and can in certain matters demand absolute obedience, the highest form for the Catholic still remains his own conscience. Catholic clericalism should not be exaggerated. On the one hand we see St. Thomas calling all Christians kings and priests, the Reg. Princ. 14. On the other we have the democracy of the beyond with its New Deal placing popes, bishops and kings in hell, as in Dante's Divine Comedy. The formula binding in conscience can thus be very misleading. Theodore de Bèze's freedom of conscience as a diabolic doctrine can well be compared with Luther's defiant attitude at the Diet of Worms, here I stand and cannot do otherwise. Yet Luther, significantly, was then still in the cowl of a Catholic friar. The Catholic has the duty of forming, educating and training his conscience so that it conforms as closely as possible to the precepts of God and His Church. Yet the Catholic who has the misfortune of losing his faith and who honestly accepts the teachings of another religious body commits a mortal sin if he does not, publicly, embrace whatever religion he believes in. Father O'Carr very wisely points out that G.B. Shaw was very much mistaken when he claimed St. Joan of Arc for Protestantism. It was precisely her defiance of ecclesiastical authority and her strict adherence to her conscience which made her canonization possible. It was the devil's advocate who, during the process, had brought up the matter of a temporary yielding to episcopal pressure. The serious character of the supremacy of conscience is described by Father Carr in the following words. The Church takes this doctrine about the primacy of conscience so seriously that she proclaims through her teachers, even in a given exceptional case where an ecclesiastical authority, a priest, a bishop, or even the Pope, were to demand something from a Catholic which would be wrong for his conscience, he would not be permitted to obey under any circumstances, and regardless of threats of the heaviest ecclesiastical penalties. When a respected theologian of the Middle Ages, Peter Lombard, proclaimed a contrary doctrine, he was universally opposed, and St. Thomas Aquinas, no less than Bonaventure and, later on, the canonists themselves, insisted on an unconditional validity of conscience. According to Catholic theology it is, therefore, quite possible that John Hus' soul went straight to heaven after his death at the stake, provided he sincerely believed in his own views, however erroneous. The Augustinian dictum, in Psalm CVI 14, how many who do not belong to us are really inside, how many of our own people are actually outside, the Church has at all times been accepted by the Catholic Church. 3. Catholicism and political behavior. The legal ideal of the Spaniard would lie in the possession of a document on which is written in clear and simple words, this man is entitled to do whatever may enter his mind. Ganivet, Idearium Español. In Chapter 3 we have pointed out the premises which Professor Lawsky considered to be indispensable for a sound parliamentary democracy, a two-party system and, b. a common framework of reference, a common language for all, but preferably only two parties. He quoted Lord Balfour, our whole political machinery presupposes a people so fundamentally at one that they can safely afford to bicker, and so sure of their own moderation that they are not dangerously disturbed by the never-ending din of political conflict. Although Catholic nations have occasionally produced a two-party system, we have to remember the short-lived experiment of the First Austrian Republic. It has to be borne in mind that these parties often had the character of camouflaged estates, with philosophical fixations, and thus remained frozen through decades. Yet it is the second Laskian precept which is so conspicuously absent in Catholic nations, and this includes countries with considerable Catholic minorities like Germany, the Netherlands and Latvia. The Netherlands had, luckily, a monarchical constitution, and thus the evolution towards dictatorship was spared to that nation. The philosophical abysses between the political parties on the European continent are far less conspicuous in Protestant nations, with their intellectual flexibility, often amounting to rank irrationalism, their relativism, and, last but not least, their totalitarian societies with their conformity and their automatic antagonism towards all radical dissenters. To all this must be added an abundance of myths, which are often very helpful in averting distractions and in preserving the status quo. Though we will never have statistics on that subject, it seems to us that the conserving myths far outnumber the destructive myths. In order to illustrate the first mentioned characteristics, Let us imagine a Norwegian commissioned officer who is a Freemason, a social democratic voter, a member of a Lutheran parish, a monarchist of a sort, and a subscriber to a genuinely liberal paper. Although we do not venture to say that such human synthesis is the rule in Protestant civilizations, they exist nevertheless, and we have known several of them. This naturally does not exclude the phenomenon of an intellectual schizophrenia, which we might encounter in any nation, but especially in Russia. The Mexican anti-clerical firebrand who sends his daughters to a convent school is a good example. It would be very unjust to charge such persons with insincerity or hypocrisy, since the ideologies they adhere to have been so strongly relativized in the liberal Protestant climate that they have ceased to be mutually exclusive and antagonistic. A Freemasonry which does not insist on its deistic philosophy, a socialism which is ready to skip the notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat, a neo-Lutheranism which doubts the virgin birth and the divinity of Christ, a spiritualism which is scientific and materialistic, a pro-communism based on vague sentimentalities, and a liberalism which rejects free enterprise, can all be blended harmoniously. But the rigidity of the concepts in the Catholic orbit would provoke, for everybody sufficiently courageous and irrational to try the synthesis, an avalanche of excommunications. The situation in the Greek Orthodox world would not be far different, especially if we consider the persecution of all who deviate from the Communist Party line in Russia. Yet it is precisely this relativism of almost all ideas, excluding the Catholicism of the dispersion, which makes for the easy and swift establishment of a common denominator, which in turn is quite rigorously enforced by all social agencies. All this fosters the growth of a virulent, though frequently not admitted, nationalism, strengthened by an amazing conformity which makes all basic dissent impossible. The division of the political parties between mere ins and outs is the logical result of this ideological uniformity. Thus a working democracy becomes possible, yet the price which has to be paid for it in terms of social control is one which the Catholic nations, in the long run at least, are not willing to pay. Sir Norman Angell very accurately described human existence in a totalitarian state when he wrote, "From the day that a child is born in Nazi Germany or Russia, and to a lesser degree in Italy, it is brought under the influence of the state's doctrine. Every teacher teaches it through the years of childhood and adolescence. In every conscript, whether military or industrial, the process is continued. Every book suggests the prevailing orthodoxy, every paper shouts it, every cinema gives it visual suggestion. That is, mutatis mutandis, precisely the situation in all countries with a well-established democracy, where social forces jealously guard the common denominator. There is no doubt that the great pride of the democracies, compulsory education, and, to a lesser degree, conscription, is a prime factor in this process of forming the minds of citizens into a uniform pattern. It is obvious that the situation which existed in the Weimar period of the German Republic, when parties were totally unable to establish a real dialogue, had to lead to anarchy or to the iron rule of one victorious party, and such a victory could be achieved either in accordance with or in circumvention of the democratic process. Before 1933 the supremacy was contested among a. two socialist parties which saw in each other abject traitors but, nevertheless, divided humanity into bourgeois and proletarians, b. ethnicists, who distinguished between Germans and non-Germans, c. racialists, who talked of Aryans and non-Aryans, d. clericals, who thought in the categories of saints and sinners or believers and non-believers, and e. Democrats deeply in love with the principle of numerical divisions. When the Nazis came to power they immediately proceeded to bring about complete uniformity in all matters. And since the Jews could not conform to the desired racial pattern, a fate was meted out to them which was even worse than that of the American Loyalists, of whom George Washington is supposed to have said that he could see nothing better than to commit suicide. Racialism in Catholic countries is less in evidence than in the Protestant orbit, but the situation as it prevailed in partly Catholic Germany has its significance for every Catholic country. From these and similar observations it is quite obvious that the political temper of Catholic nations is singularly unfit for parliamentary government, save in the small Catholic Swiss cantons where, due to their size and predominantly agrarian character, the dreaded mass democracy could not develop, and some sort of familial color in the political system can be preserved. Catholic personalism and individualism found its most concrete expression in the strong federalistic, i.e., anti-centralistic, tradition of the Catholic cantons. The War of Confederacy, Sonderbundskrieg, of 1847 saw the Catholic cantons, save one, lined up in defense of federalism against the Protestant cantons eager to enforce centralization. This war, in a sense, paralleled those of 1861-65, the American War between the states, and 1866, the so-called Austro-Prussian War. Federalism in the European anti-centralistic sense has always been part and parcel of Catholic political ideologies. The opposition of American Catholicism to the Child Labor Amendment was due to its proposed character of a federal law. The whole Catholic and conservative movement in Europe was always federalistic in outlook, condemning centralization and separatism alike. Almost all leftist movements were practically or programmatically centralistic, yet Catholic countries also produced a few leftist movements which were federalistic. See Lord Acton's History of Freedom, p. 98. Pseudo-conservatism in Spain is centralistic, as opposed to the two genuinely Spanish movements, Anarchism and Carlism, which are federalistic and in favor of local autonomy. Neither atomization nor leveling lies within the Catholic religious tradition. What it demands is variety and unity. Hence also the manifoldness of Catholic religious orders, which show such a wide range in their character and structure. Yet if there must be extremism, then a wild individualism takes precedence over its opposite form. As a result, anarchism rather than communism or socialism is the classic form of radicalism in the Catholic orbit. Even in the Protestant mind, the anarchist will always be an individual from a Catholic or a Greek Orthodox country, and never a member of a Protestant nation. The assassin with a black beard and a smoking bomb is neither an Englishman nor a Swede nor a Prussian, but possibly an Irishman or, even more likely, a Spaniard, an Italian or a Russian. Incidentally, what in European conversations is often glibly called a Bolshevik is in reality frequently an anarchist. The superior propaganda of the Third International has unfortunately attracted millions in Western Europe who are anarchists at heart but, lacking something better, both the communist ticket. We are faced here by a tragic misunderstanding, without parallel in Catholic Germany or Austria, because these regions had the privilege of visual education. In France and Italy, the comedy of errors continue, with millions expecting from communism the end of all controls and total liberty, not total control and a planned economy. In continental parlance, the Catholics are often referred to as the black ones, but black is also the color of the anarchist flag. It is for the anarchist, then, that even the European Catholic rightist had a weak spot in his heart. Rarely has public opinion in the Old World been more stirred, regardless of party affiliations, than by the Sacco and Vanzetti case. Vanzetti's earthly remains were interred in an Italian cemetery, where a local cult soon developed with the toleration of the fascist authorities. A book about the two executed anarchists was published in Naples. Arnaldo Mussolini, brother of the dictator, wrote a leading article on the two revolutionaries in the Popolo d'Italia, which was incorporated into the aforementioned volume as a preface. Anarchism, of course, was nothing new in the Mussolini family. The father of the Duce himself was an anarchist, and gave to his older son the Spanish name of Benito for Benito Juárez. The Italian form would have been Benedetto, while the younger son was named Arnaldo after Arnaldo di Brescia, the great anti-papalist rebel. Yet unlike his older brother, Arnaldo always followed a papal orientation. From all the foregoing, it is evident that Catholicism, including Greek Orthodoxy, does not harmonize with the bourgeois spirit and the whole mentality of the middle class. This disharmony affects all continental countries, including Germany, including France. Even the more sensitive English Catholics will manifest skepticism towards the bourgeois values. The reasons for this attitude are manifold. They are historical as well as sociological, psychological as well as religious. Last but not least, they have to be found in the democratic affinities of the urban middle classes, affinities whose teleology leads clearly to communism, Nazism and other totalitarian heresies. About the attitude of Catholic cultures towards racialism we have written elsewhere. Here, as in all other fields of our investigation, not the attitude of individual Catholics, who in the dispersion may easily be affected by the traditions of the majority, but those of the multitudes in Catholic nations have to be analyzed. Moreover, it must never be forgotten that Catholicism, in spite of its historical paternity, is a stranger in the modern world. Non-Catholic cultural patterns affect the most Catholic of civilizations. Even the Tyrolean peasant, the Italian Benedictine monk and the Basque Jesuit are influenced to a certain degree by Calvin, Marx, Adam Smith, Bentham, Descartes, Rousseau, and Thomas Paine. Still, it can be said that racialism in Catholic countries was always weak, and that anti-Judaism in Catholic and Greek Orthodox countries always had a religious, and not a biological, bias. Hitler's revolution failed, significantly enough. In Black Munich, he succeeded democratically, by elections, in conquering the Reich from the north. The difference between racial concepts in British and French colonies, or between America and Brazil, is obvious. The reasons have to be found in religious commandments and, even more so, in more basic attitudes derived from religious notions. Taken all in all, the picture the Catholic nations offer us contains light and dark sides. If we are permitted to generalize, these nations emerge as a rather individualistic and violent crowd, tending towards extremes, partly cynical and partly devout, in the worst case for hire rather than for sale, hardly given to respect or reverence, independent, aloof, uncooperative, undisciplined and skeptical, in one sense splendidly adjusted to this world and, in another one, not at all, strong in their hatreds and affections, proud, and more admirable under stress and duress than in everyday life. Whether one prefers their intensely human world to that of enlightened Protestantism is primarily a matter of religion. Lacking belief in a specific creed, this choice would depend on personal tastes and affinities. Still, it must be borne in mind that, whatever our stand may be, religious patterns are of the greatest political importance. The full realization that the Catholic world is faced by the simple alternative of the patriarch or the policeman would have spared millions of lives. 4. Catholicism and the forms of government. This alternative, it must be repeated again, does not exclude the fact that Catholic nations can, in a social sense, be more democratic, more demophile than Protestant countries. Just because the Church insists that only God can see into the heart of a person, a seemingly egalitarian position is often taken. And just because these nations are not genuinely egalitarian, they still can claim to be liberal in the original sense of the term. Dr. Henry Smith Leeper wrote very correctly, Europe is often said to have rejected democracy. In a sense that remains true. But no intelligent man is entitled to conclude from that fact that Europeans no longer love freedom. Over a century ago, George Tickner, the open-minded Bostonian traveler, who in Austria went from monastery to monastery, noted in his diary, in all 3 monasteries, as well as in the 2 or 3 monks I saw at Heiligenkreuz, I have found a more liberal and even republican tone the prevalent one. The intellectual absolutism of Catholicism has not even impaired the individualistic aspects of medieval civilization. If we are looking for free societies, we have to search for them among the Catholic and Greek Orthodox nations, yet these have, at best, established only relatively free governments. They have to choose between monarchy and dictatorship. Experience also has taught us that the change from the republican form of government to tyranny is far swifter than from democracy to monarchy. Thus the great efforts in the immediate past to enforce democracy in the Old World, and in the New, have ended in the long run with dictatorship and a catastrophic decline of personal liberties. The short demo-liberal interlude is terminated by the advent of tyranny. Since only 13% of the population of the European continent are followers of Protestant creeds, and since the efforts to make the world safe for democracy were largely directed against the Catholic and the mixed zone, the results of all these endeavors have been disastrous. Civil liberties in Russia, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, Spain, Portugal, and Albania are today considerably less than in 1900. The future of constitutional democratic government is promising neither in Germany and Austria nor in France and Italy. The revolutionary ferment has destroyed all Catholic monarchic institutions, save in Belgium, and the outlook in the Greek Orthodox world is not much brighter. Protestantism, on the other hand, with its flexibility, was able to effect a synthesis between progress, democracy, liberalism, tradition and religion. As a result, quite paradoxical at the first glance, monarchy has become the Protestant form of government. Conversely, republicanism in Europe becomes more and more synonymous with tyranny. There are now only 2 free Protestant republics, the United States and Finland, with a Switzerland of mixed religion, 42% Catholic, trailing after them. There are only these 3 well-established liberal democratic republics in the world. France, perhaps, can be called lucky if she becomes a dictatorship under de Gaulle, as the least of all evils. If we judge this military leader by his famous book, Le Fil de l'Épée, we must come to the conclusion that he has always been a frank and wholehearted supporter of an authoritarian regime. Italian democracy, on the other hand, may well be a stillborn child, strangled at the moment of its birth by the umbilical cord of a not-so-very democratic peace treaty. The necessary conditions for a sound parliamentary democracy are, naturally, neither on this nor on the other side of the Mont Cenis. And we can doubt whether they ever will be. Nor in Spain. This is quite evident when we read the thumbnail sketch of Spanish political history given by General Franco in a speech to the Cortes in May, 1946, nor in Germany, nor in Danubia, nor in the Balkans, nor on the Volga, nor anywhere south of the Rio Grande. It would, nevertheless, be a great error to think that continental Europeans do not have a genuine desire for liberty and a healthy framework for the free development of their personalities. The only possible hope they have is a monarchical restoration, but this hope is extremely dim. Curiously enough, the recognition that the good old times are those of monarchical tyranny prior to 1914 is quite general. The masses, in the quest for bread and security, are no less conscious of this commonplace than the intellectuals eager for liberty. And yet there is at the same time a far-reaching disbelief in the possibility of a return to this one and only form of government that harmonizes with the Catholic temper and promises a minimum of sanity, balance and peace. The USSR and the USA do not favor restoration, and are historically and psychologically bound to oppose it. The United Kingdom is in a very similar situation. In 1945, Austrian monarchist leaders, just released from Nazi concentration camps, were temporarily jailed by the Western Allies. Under the circumstances, there can be little hope for an integration of social inclinations and political forms in the Old World. Not even a miraculous destruction or quick elimination of Catholicism would help, because the cultural pattern remains for some time even if its theological cause is removed. Joseph de Maistre's dictum that large nations can only be ruled by religion or slavery, one or the other, is as true today as it was 120 years ago. Madariaga's thesis that Spaniards are moved by two historical forces, dictatorship and separatism, slavery and anarchy, is true for the rest of the Catholic world, though the Spanish case is the most extreme of all. The alternative to this choice remains unalterably the familial order of monarchy based on affection. Nothing can replace it. Nor should it be forgotten that the countries of continental Europe all need a mission, a final end, a metaphysical goal, which even elections, increased exports, more calories and better dental care are not going to obviate. All this is of great importance to America, not because she harbors millions of Catholics. They are culturally assimilated and follow a political tradition which harmonizes very well with a specific Catholic school of political thought. The importance lies in the fact that the Catholic world coexists with America on the same planet, in the same hemisphere, on the same continent. Today the Catholic nations, without exception, are going through an enormous crisis. They are not only decimated by the war and under pressure from the Colossus in the East, but they are also in an agonia in the Spanish sense of the word, in an internal struggle for life and death. They have not recovered from the blows of the last few centuries, nor found the political institutions congenial to them. They have not been able to adapt their societies to the forms of government fostered and favored, enforced and impressed by the outside. They, even more so the observers on the sidelines, have understood neither the basic difference between liberalism and democracy nor the teleological antithesis between these two trends. Yet it is virtually certain that the Catholic nations, with their love for personal liberty, their earthly pessimism, their pride and skepticism, will never in their hearts accept parliamentary democracy. This must be borne in mind by all their friends and well-wishers, who should remember Vauban argues saying, the usual pretext of those who make others miserable is that they want to do them good. Only if they strive to help the European continent to find its own soul will they act constructively. Only thus can the continent hope to become again what it used to be, a tierra libre y real, a free and royal land.